Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final RAD chat before World Read Aloud Day 2021. My name is Amber Peterson, and I am the Director of Program Innovation for LitWorld. LitWorld is a nonprofit that strengthens kids and communities through the power of story by partnering with phenomenal, on-the-ground, community-based organizations all over the world to deliver literacy-based social-emotional programming for young people. In 2010, LitWorld founded World Read Aloud Day, an opportunity for people all around the globe to celebrate the joy of reading aloud and to advocate for oral storytelling as a tool for building community, literacy skills, and equity. In the decade since, the day has engaged millions of people around the globe, both in person and online, and we are super excited for this year's celebration next week, Wednesday, on February 3rd. Reading aloud is such a powerful, accessible, and impactful action with multifaceted impact, and our RAD Chat series has been an opportunity for us to discuss and celebrate it with some of LitWorld's amazing friends and partners. Make sure you check out all of our discussions on Facebook and YouTube, and make sure that you are checking out litworld.org/World Read Aloud Day for resources as you get ready for World Read Aloud Day next week. Today, our three panelists are very special guests. So they'll join me on screen now. We have, of course, joining us the absolutely incomparable Pam Allen, who is not only the founder of LitWorld and World Read Aloud Day, but she is also a renowned literacy expert and the author of over 30 books for both educators and parents about young people's learning lives, including Every Child a Super Reader, which explores and shares the LitWorld 7 Strengths pedagogy, and was co-authored by another panelist, the incredible Dr. Ernest Morrell, who is a celebrated author, academic researcher, and educator. He is the Coyle Professor in Literacy Education and the Director of the Center of Literacy Education at the University of Notre Dame. Among other accolades, he is an elected fellow of the American Educational Research Association and a past president of the National Council of the Teachers of English. And it is our privilege to have Ernest on LitWorld's board of directors. And last, but certainly not least, we have the amazing Dr. Lester Laminack, who is Professor Emeritus at Western Carolina University. In addition to being an award-winning educator, he is also the acclaimed author of a wide range of books for both educators and children, with a special focus on the power of reading aloud and making him the perfect person to round out our panel. So welcome, everyone. We are deeply honored to have such an amazing and illustrious group of experts with us here today.
Thank you, Amber. It's great to be here all together.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you guys all. So to jump right into our questions, all of you and the work that you do have emphasized at some point the importance of reading aloud. Can each of you share a little bit about why this particular action is so important to you and such a big part of your advocacy? And maybe we can start with Pam as the founder of LitWorld. World Read Aloud Day.
All right. Well, of course, I love that question. I'll say, just to tap back into my most essential elemental self, my childhood self, I would say that the Read Aloud had a very profound impact on me from my grandparents. I pay a lot of tribute to them in every day of my work. Both my grandmothers were teachers, so they really loved reading to me, and I still hear their voices in my heart as I do this work. And once I started to teach, I started to see that the read aloud itself just conveys a tremendous power and connection to children of all ages, young adults as well. My first, before I started LitWorld, the seeds of the work of LitWorld started in a place called Children's Village, which is an agency for residential agency for children, vulnerable children. And what I found there was that the Read Aloud bridged so many gaps that the children may have had in their understanding of what literacy could mean to them, and really brought us all together in a very, very profoundly beautiful way. And so since those days, I have felt a strong commitment that the Read Aloud gives us an opportunity to lift our voices for equity and for the right of every young person to feel the power of literature. So I'm just thrilled that we've been able to all together, this amazing group right here, to build and extend the power of World Read Aloud Day to show off some of that incredible benefit.
Absolutely. I think that is part of the beauty of reading aloud, is that it's so accessible, and we all have some sort of personal connection to it, whether it's our own experiences growing up or experiencing it in school. So thank you for that. Ernest and Lester?
Sure. I just would pick up on what Pam said, and I wrote down kind of 5 areas that I thought were important. The first one, Pam addressed, read alouds provide us with a reading sponsor, someone to demonstrate the joy and power of reading. You can't underestimate that connection, whether it's grandmothers or a teacher in school or a neighbor. Just their love for reading and love of story becomes infectious. It develops a vocabulary too. It gives kids access to books they normally can't access alone. And that's a really important part, kind of bringing them along. And certainly the kids can understand the story, but they're not always able to read the stories that we can read aloud to them. But intellectually, they're ready. So they experience some of that vocabulary orally before they actually read it themselves. It really opens the door to questions and beautiful conversation. I'm humbled to be talking about this, because this is a lot that I've learned from Lester and Pam. But it's not reading to kids, it's reading with kids, and it's a conversation. And that's important. And it can become a beautiful dialogue, whether it's a one-on-one with a child in the family, a younger sibling, or your own child, or it's students in the classroom, because they certainly will have something to say if we open the door for them in that communication. To Pam and ours work and our work together, Amber, in Lit World, it creates belonging and community. You walk into a classroom and kids lean in during the read aloud, right? I mean, there's no one leaning back in the read aloud. Everyone's leaning in together and they have their hands up and they want to share. You say, Lester, what do you think? And Lester might be talking about something that happened in the summer with his dad in the park. And but that belonging is really important, even above and beyond what happens in kind of the reading aspect of it, is the togetherness. It increases kids to desire to read on their own. Sometimes you'll see a young kid just go and start mouthing the words to the story that mom or grandma or dad just read to them. And it's fun. It's definitely a fun activity for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And I think that point of reading with kids, I think we often don't necessarily think about it that way. We think about it as something we're doing for kids, but it's such a mutually beneficial experience. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think in addition to all of that, there is an element of the connection between humans. The idea that when an adult or even an older child, when a reader pulls a non-reader in and holds them close, and the bond between them is the book, there's something stronger than the model of reading. There's something stronger than the development of vocabulary and all that academic stuff. There is this sort of nonverbal statement that at this moment, you are my singular focus. Mm-hmm. And there is nothing more important that I could spend my time on at this moment than you, because I believe that toddlers love listening to story. I don't doubt that at all. But I think the thing they hunger for most is that undivided attention that they get from the adult who can read. And they climb in that lap, and it's about this notion that they understand at a very early age that the book itself is the hinge between you and me. And that this is the place where you open yourself to me in the most uninhibited way, and in a way that has no distractions. If I ask you to put a puzzle together with me, you might say, in a little while, let me finish this project I'm doing. If I ask you to help me build something with blocks or play restaurant, you might look at me and go, well, we'll do that in a little while. Let me finish the laundry. But if a child asks an adult, read this to me, an adult will stop and read. Children know very quickly that it's the magic key to the undivided attention. of those people who are most significant to them.
Absolutely. I think that's such a beautiful point about this intimacy of that act as well. And kind of a perfect segue into my next question, which is really thinking about reading out loud as a form of oral storytelling. And just storytelling itself as a tool for building community and bringing us closer together. Can all of you talk a little bit about why storytelling is important, both from an academic standpoint and from a social standpoint?
Well, I would just say that the story, I mean, the power of reading together, as everybody has said so beautifully, is that we're always making sense of the world. We're always trying to figure out, as humans, where do I fit in? Who am I in this big, vast universe of people? And I think what storytelling does for us is it shapes us. It gives us a way to put ourselves into something, a container, and try to make sense of it. And when we're reading aloud to children or young adults, and we share the array of literature, and we most definitively share a wide array of culturally responsive, linguistically responsive literature, we're saying that you belong to this world of story, that your story matters, that the people we're reading about, that the other child we're reading about, that the animals we're reading about, the places we're reading about, those all belong to you too. That, Ernest said, you mentioned, Ernest, the word belonging, which is the first of LitWorld's 7 strengths, and such a resonant strength indeed. But I think that the storytelling part itself of the read aloud is anchoring us to say, you belong here, and you belong here, and you belong here. So whether I'm listening to a poem or a piece of nonfiction or a beautiful narrative, I can find myself somewhere, or find a new world, to walk through a new door. And I think that's the power of it. When I think about myself as a child, and I think about the unfolding discovery of myself as I grew, and each time I was reading or someone was reading to me, that layered a new understanding of myself. It wasn't just me awakening to the world. It was that story was helping me make sense of myself in the world and helping me to have a voice. I think we've seen that at LitWorld, that the children in our lit clubs and lit camps, they use the power of story to say, I am here, I am important, I matter to the world, and that I can actually change the world with the power of my storytelling. That the girls in the countries we serve, where they had not yet had a chance to go to school, and then the lit clubs gave them that opportunity, and they could tell their stories and listen to the oral storytelling coming around them in those lit clubs, and of their elders that were leading the lit clubs, gave them a sense of not only belonging, but actually the courage to say, we can change the world with the power of our stories. And I think that storytelling is just, it's a tool for freedom, it's a tool for change, and it's a tool to completely transform society, but everybody has to have a chance to do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love what you're kind of saying about that story being an invitation in a lot of ways, an invitation to interact with the world, however you want to, really.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had one response, and listening to Pam, I wrote another response in response to Pam's.
That's how we go. That's exactly how we do
it. In this group, you don't want to go second or third because they're going to say everything you were going to say. But
no, that is never true. We always have more to say about this. I feel like Lester, Ernest, and I could, if you put us in a room together to talk about this, we could probably layer upon layer of ideas could just roll forth.
Yeah,
I'm glad we're catching it all on camera.
Exactly. So my response to Pam's response, everything Pam said, and story, I think, is how we find ourselves, or even more poignantly, how we manifest ourselves in the world. And I was thinking about Henry Louis Gates' introduction to the slave narratives, where he says story is how we write, read, and think ourselves into being. It's how we become. It's how culture happens. It's how, as Toni Morrison says, rememory happens. It's how we know we're here. When you think about read alouds, there are two aspects of it, and this is kind of duplicating some of what Pam said already. Read alouds can, and I emphasize the can, give us an appreciation of the stories of others, the breadth and complexity and beauty in the world. But hopefully, read alouds to be really beneficial academically and socially are just the starting point of a conversation, a portal where we allow students to share their own stories as well. Storytelling can't be a monologue. Storytelling has to be a dialogue. It has to be communal. There has to be an audience. And as Lester was saying, the toddler who crawls in the lap will have plenty of stories to share with the person who's reading to them about the story and about everything. Pam has said kind of reading is breathing in and writing is breathing out. And so we really are seeing storytelling, and we're talking about read alouds as what happens in that particular read aloud, but it's everything that it opens the door to, the relationships, the interchange of ideas, the sharing of stories, that makes it really powerful socially, I think.
Absolutely.
I think other than saying, all that, just so I actually, contribute there. I think story is how we move through the world, and it's what makes us human. Story is how we make sense of yesterday. It's how we put order to things that have already happened. And so we say things like, oh God, did I tell you what happened to me yesterday? I don't think that most people in their interactions with humans every day think of that as story, but it is. You don't make a list, and you don't get up and read a script. You create a story. And if you share that same story with 6 different people, it evolves, because you, as the storyteller, groove off of what the listeners are doing. And when that first listener stops you someplace and says, say that again, what did you say? You realize that's the part that builds tension. That's the part that gets something. In many ways, then, storytelling is rehearsal for writing. It is the place where a child or an adult tries out the audience and figures out which pieces of the language work best. It's the way we make sense of yesterday, but it's also how we navigate today. We move through this day talking about what we're going to do and how we're making sense of things. And I was on my way to the post office, but oh my gosh, this deer ran right out in front of me and I had to go in a ditch. We're narrating today and putting all these crazy, chaotic, random pieces into some order that allows us to not feel chaotic. Story helps us weave the bits into something solid. And story is also how we imagine the future. So story takes us from the past, it navigates through the current times, and it allows us to imagine something that's not yet happening. And we see that very clearly in the world of toddlers and preschoolers and young primary grades kids when they pretend. But grown-ups do it too. I mean, you go buy a lottery ticket and the pot is 300 million. You sit around for about 10 minutes with a glass of whiskey and kind of talk to your friends and go, oh my God, if I win that, I am so going to pay off the mortgage. And then I'm going to be nicer than the richest rich person ever. I'm going to be so generous. And then I'm going to get that cabin I've always wanted in the Adirondacks. And, you love the beach. I swear I'll buy you a beach house if I win this lottery. You imagine something that isn't as if it could be, which is what we do when we pretend. And it is the hallmark of fiction. We create something that isn't but could be. Fiction only works if it's believable as truth. It isn't true, but it could be. And if it can't be, then it's not fiction. It's fantasy. So, we're all playing with it. Story is this amazingly magical thing that we so totally underestimate in our schools.
I think I just would add that to that, what you're saying, kind of confluencing what you both said, but I would just to think about how I love the point about that idea of pretending. Maybe that's why I love all this so much, because I always did as a kid. I was always pretending, and I love that we're still doing that. I think too, though, it's also about the hard parts of life, that it's practicing to tell the story as a story of overcoming, of triumph, of pushing through the hard parts, even in the truth telling, even not in the pretend, not in the imagining of the better future, but even in the right here and now, to say, listen, this was a hard day, but we got through it together. This was a time when, we, as a community, we weren't able to be physically together, but we still have found a way to come together. I feel like story is like, it's healing us, even as we're experiencing hardship. It's I'm going to practice telling this story in a way that feels triumphant, feels like I can overcome something.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Pam. And, when I started with people like Henry Louis Gates and Toni Morrison, and then, particular traditions, it's kind of sometimes what story is put up against. And story can be put up against history. Story can be put up against media and fact. It's how you speak yourself into being. So this idea of rememory as being very distinct from history. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves would be very different than 2 paragraphs in an American history textbook on the period between the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. It could be a whole Toni Morrison novel, and so this world of pretend is also the ability to create a world and inhabit a world that you might not have access to otherwise. And that's so important to say, I can storify myself, right? There's an ownership over it. Authors give us a particular inroad into that, but there's a tremendous amount of ownership and agency, and we can form collectives around the stories that we tell that in some ways kind of inoculate us from these external realities that sometimes, we're forced to engage, but we don't have to be defined by.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's powerful. I really think so. I think it's so powerful because that idea of inhabiting worlds, that's where I feel like then story is political, it's ethical, it's radical, it's revolutionary. It's because there's so many ways and places, whether it's about that historical context or even right now, where some stories have been marginalized and pushed out and removed and silenced. And so that's why, even though we talk about World Read Aloud Day, it's so joyous and so wonderful, and it's so soothing and loving for children. It's also, to me, I take this idea of reading and story so seriously. It's like the most serious work we do, because the hidden voice or the disappeared voice or the voice that did not get to do that transcendent work of inhabiting the world, or, as we're all saying, this idea of inventing the world, creating the world, that to me, that's like the disempowerment. That's what we want to change, and I think story is the tool that can do that.
Absolutely. I love one of the world's taglines is "Be the Story," and I think you all kind of spoke a little bit about how it's we are the story. we live the story every single day, and reading aloud, sharing stories, storytelling is the way that we kind of just articulate life. that is literally what it is. And in that vein, we often talk about reading aloud and storytelling as a tool for promoting equity, both in the classroom and on a global scale. We often talk about things like access in terms of book choice and diversity, which you touched a little bit upon, Pam. For all of you, what is important to keep in mind as we create these, powerful and wonderful storytelling spaces for young people?
I can go ahead and jump in. So the first point I had was to make it fun. And the human connection that Lester and Pam have already spoken to powerfully. But sometimes what happens in school is kids who we see as advanced or enriched get fun activities, and kids who are seen as being remediated, it's always moments of stress. So I think it just happens more naturally in a read aloud. But if it's fun, and then 2, if it's interactive. that I'm really trying to pull out your voice and your opinions. We can tell kids that we think that they're brilliant, or we can allow them to share their brilliance with others. And that to me is a true equity pedagogy. Pam mentioned this point. The books we select should show the diversity and the beauty and the complexity of the human family, past and present. We can try to be scientific and oversampling that, but what we really want is a plurality of discourse and ways for kids to find themselves in that. Making time for it, particularly in school, that I don't think there's any more important activity for all the reasons that Lester and Pam have said than reading aloud with kids and to kids. And there are some times where we say we can't find the time for that because we have to do all these other things. If you haven't inspired a joy and love of reading, nothing else that you do is really going to matter. So we have to make the time, and we have to do it often. And don't worry about, I don't know what to do, because what you're doing when you're reading aloud is what you're supposed to be doing, and that is having a joyous engagement with kids around reading. Certainly there are resources out there, and Lester has, more resources that I point to than anyone. But you will say, Lester, right? Get started, right? Just, jump in. And so sometimes people, they're reticent, especially at home. Like, I don't know that I can do it like you do it in school. And then finally, show your kids your joy and love of reading openly, and invite them into that world as kind of co-creators, as co-experts, as co-generators of beautiful language. I can't think of anything more that just kind of elevates classroom life than a bunch of bumbling interlocutors who are connected in a unity around their stories. The numbers, that stuff will take care of itself if we just do these things. We kind of create warm environments that are rich with language and rich with dialogue and rich with love, if we're allowed to still say that word as we think about education.
I hope so.
Absolutely. In terms of ways that both individuals and institutions can kind of embrace not just reading aloud, but storytelling, what are some of the suggestions that you might have for anyone who wants to celebrate World Read Aloud Day, or at all, any time of the year? Again, we often talk about the fact that World Read Aloud Day is the celebration, but reading aloud is all year long. There's no limit to that. So how do we start to make this part of our routine? How do we celebrate it?
Well, I think the word you used, how do we make it part of our routine? The idea is to think of it as a routine. Every classroom has moments of transition. If you're in a self-contained classroom, like a second grade classroom, there's transition between every subject matter. There's transition for going to lunch and coming back from lunch. You're going out of the room out to PE or out to music and coming back. If you're in a classroom like a middle grade language arts class and you change at the end of a period, there's still the beginning of class, the moving into class, and the moving out of class. Any one of those transitions could be done with a read aloud. And that read aloud does not have to be like an entire picture book or a whole chapter of a chapter book. It could be a scene from a chapter. It could be a short opinion piece. There could be the poem we read every time we get ready to go to music. And just like the signal in Mr. Rogers' television show, every day he fed the fish. And it might look like we're just learning to nurture and take care of something, but it actually was a transition signal between moving from the living room to moving to the kitchen. It was the signal that says we are now leaving the place where we listen to music and read stories, and we're moving into the place where we do science experiments and make art, because we need the table and we need the access to the sink and the counter and the materials. But he doesn't stop to explain what we're doing. He doesn't clap 3 times or flash a yellow light or have a bell that he rings. He simply feeds the fish. What if we simply read a poem? And over a period of 10, 15, 20 days, kids came to understand that when you read that poem, it means we're getting ready to go to music. And when you stop to read a chapter of the continuing book, we're transitioning from going to lunch to coming back to academics. And when you open the morning with a story, I know that the opening read aloud is going to be a focus on building community and making friends and working together, that each time you read aloud, there is a particular focus. And I would say that perhaps the thing that we need to be very conscious about making read aloud feel like a routine is to be certain that we practice it with intention, that it isn't an incidental thing that just fills up some spare time, but that we plan what we read, how we will read it, when we will read it, with the same care we give to the preparation for math manipulatives or the preparation of a science lab. Otherwise, it will not be taken seriously. And so we have to think about that with intention.
I love that.
Yeah,
I love that
me
idea.
too.
Just making
Me too. And reading read aloud role models, you know, there's so many great authors, Lester, you being one, who do this online, where teachers listening today can actually go onto YouTube and see people doing this work, because it is, I agree with you. I think it takes so much practice, even just slowing down and really savoring in the white spaces of the reading. And I would just say, just one thought from my end in terms of thinking about the classroom and creating those storytelling spaces is that we not judge what children want to reread or want to hear again. That when we say, oh, that book is too easy, or we've read that already, or let's not go back to it, is actually rereading our favorite picture books, chapter books, actually has huge merit for the child's and young adults developing growing brain. And also, as Ernest, you said earlier about that kind of critical thinking stance that we take when we're listening to a read aloud, that it's a dialogue, not a monologue. It gives us a chance when we go back and reread familiar text to actually have a deeper dialogue. And with older students who see that, oh, that's a familiar book, to say, how can we go deeper? How can we think about this read aloud as a call to action to change the world? If we read this book today, what could we do that would make the world different? And then the other thing I'll just say is just one last thing is to expand our repertoire. Yes to poetry, yes to narrative, but also, you know, one of my greatest and most dearest memories of my father is him reading the sports pages aloud to me from the dining room table in high school. He was a big Cleveland fan, and his teams never won anything, and yet he loved to read aloud from those pages to me. He would love it, and he really just relished it. And I think, to me, that you know, I learned a lot about sports just from that. So I think that, you know, remembering that children and young adults, they love to hear lots of different genres, and they also love to be read to familiar texts that will lift the conversation even higher.
Absolutely. I think, you know, one thing that I'm kind of taking away from both what Pam and Lester just said is kind of the flexibility of reading aloud to be something that can be very precious, and we really kind of create ritual and moment around it, but it also doesn't have to be so precious. It can be that thing we do as part of the transition, which is precious in its own way, but maybe not quite so intimidating as people sometimes think it can be. Thank you guys all so much for joining us today. I'm just looking at the time. We're at 33 minutes. This is the beginning of a beautiful conversation, and I hope we get to continue it you know, throughout the year. Again, World Read Aloud Day doesn't have to just be on World Read Aloud Day. For everyone who's listening, thank you so much for tuning in. For more information about all of the panelists, please check out their bios and information in the description for this event. And of course, do not forget to go to litworld.org/World Read Aloud Day for more resources and for celebrating World Read Aloud Day next week, Wednesday, on February 3rd. We are very much looking forward to celebrating with all of you. Shooting stars to all of our panelists, and shooting stars to everybody who is watching. Until next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Amber.
Bye.
Bye.